Hello, listeners. This is Kat, and welcome back to Put Your Hands Up Podfix. This will be the continuation of State of Mind. This will be Part 17, Chapter 13, entitled Crawling. The morning light shining into the room woke Shoto up, and he frowned, looking around. He was not in his own hospital bed. In fact, Shoto looked down at Izuku, who had moved into a different position. His injured leg kicked out, and the other folded underneath him. His arms were lax, his left on his lap, and the right over Shoto's leg, wrapped in bandages. The only thing that remained the same was the boy's head still on Shoto's shoulder. "I was wondering which one of you would wake up first," a voice said, and Shoto's head jerked up. Ida was watching them, with an amused expression, leaning against the wall on his bed, his phone in his hands. He gestured to them. "He's been making noises in his sleep." Shoto looked down at Izuku again, worried. After the day before, Izuku was bound to be troubled. Shoto couldn't help but remember Izuku's despondent voice, stating that he had felt the Nomu die. Shoto had no idea what that was like, or how to help him. Izuku suddenly groaned, knocking Shoto out of his thoughts, his hand clenching against Shoto's leg. "Izuku," he whispered. Ida's brow raised at the given name usage, but didn't say anything. Shoto brought a hand up to tap the boy's face. "Izuku," he repeated, and Izuku's eyelids fluttered before he tensed, tilting his head to look up at Shoto. Shoto's heart skipped a beat. Izuku's eyes were hazy and full of fear. It faded after a moment, though, and Izuku seemed to relax slightly, inhaling deeply. It was then that the green-haired boy seemed to realize the position he was in, and leaned away from Shoto. "Sorry, Todoroki, I didn't mean to." "Shoto," Shoto corrected him, and Izuku stilled. "What?" He frowned. "Don't you remember?" He leaned towards Izuku, whose frown deepened before realization flooded across his features, and a blush crept up his cheeks. "I remember." Izuku nodded, and his hand went up to scratch the back of his neck. The awkward air was interrupted by Gran Torino and Manuel stepping into the room, shortly followed by Hosu's chief of police, Suragame. And that conversation went about as well as could be expected. Afterward, after a long conversation with each other, Todoroki was able to leave the hospital. Gran Torino brought Izuku's things from the internship to him, and then sat with him for a bit. By the time night fell, Ida was leaving as well, and then Izuku was completely alone. He texted in the group chat for some time, but everyone else, for the most part, were busy with their internships, so Izuku ended up listening to music, having retrieved his headphones from the bag Gran had brought for him. The hospital slumbered while Izuku listened to his music, and he tried unsuccessfully to sleep. Eventually, he slid down from the bed to lay on the hard floor, curling into a ball. He was able to fall into a fitful sleep some time after that, the cool tile beneath his cheek. The next day, Izuku was looked over and healed, and given instructions to take it easy for a couple days. He was then left alone in the hospital room, after being told that he was allowed to leave. Izuku moved to the bathroom with his yellow backpack. His clothes were in it, and he pulled those out, hesitating when he found his newly washed by Gran Torino Galaxy leggings. He held them up against his cheek, burying his face in the soft fabric for a moment. He was sad and lonely. He had confronted a major villain, almost by himself for the first half of that fight, and everything had happened so fast. He had faced death, again. He had felt it in his mind when the Nomu had been killed by Stain, and he could still feel it, like a chill running down his spine, and a dark shadow flitting at the edge of his vision. Death was always present now that he had felt it so much. A knock on the bathroom door had Izuku jumping so hard he bounced into a wall, a sharp yelp escaping him. "Midoriya, you all right?" a voice said, and Izuku tilted his head. Was that Aizawa? "I'm okay," Izuku called out, unsure, before changing out of his hospital gown and getting into the clothes he was most comfortable with, clothes that made him feel like himself. Dark galaxy print leggings with only a splattering of scattered, realistic stars, nothing bright this time. Dark green shorts over them, and an oversized long-sleeved black shirt that had a spaceman on the front of it, with a skull instead of a face behind the glass of its spacesuit. Izuku pulled on his beanie and slung his backpack across his shoulders before walking out of the bathroom. He was surprised to find Aizawa leaning casually against the wall by the exit of the room, his eyes closed. "Why are you here?" Izuku asked, surprise evident in his voice. Aizawa cracked open an eye, leaning off of the wall. "Well, I came to take you home, of course." Izuku flinched, taking a step back. "Home?" Aizawa seemed to realize what he'd said, because his eyes widened the smallest amount. But then he shrugged and nodded. "Yeah, kid, home. Come on, Wink is waiting on you." The man opened the door and exited, leaving Izuku shell-shocked. Home? What even was a home? Izuku followed Aizawa to the elevator, limping slightly from the residual pain in his thigh, and then outside to the car silently, lost in his head. Aizawa opened the car door for him, and Izuku climbed inside gratefully, settling into it gently, immediately pulling his knees to his chest, despite the movement stressing his leg. Shota was concerned, to say the least. Midoriya seemed different. Shota thought he had seen all of Midoriya's moods: excited, depressed, sad, panicked, desperate. But this was different. It was hard to see. Shota started the vehicle, watching the ball that was the kid out of the corner of his eye. He pulled out onto the road and broke the silence. "Kid, are you okay?" Midoriya looked up at him with glassy eyes and shook his head. Shota blinked in surprise at Midoriya's honesty, before looking back to the road. "Do you want to talk about it?" "You are allowed to. Mike and I were debriefed about what actually happened aside from the official report of what happened." Midoriya seemed to pull himself into a tighter ball before speaking. "So much happened, and I can't deal with it." His voice was soft, but pained, and Shota almost had to strain to hear him. "When I first got there, I thought I was too late. I thought Ida was dead." Midoriya sucked in a shuddering breath. His whole body was shaking. Shota let him talk. This was something he needed to get out, and Shota could be a soundboard for the kid. "Stain was killing people just because he had his own definition of what a hero was and no one met it," Midoriya said, rubbing the heels of his hands against his eyes. "And that the Nomu was there." Midoriya hissed between his teeth, curling into himself even further, his hand still rubbing at his eyes. Shota reached over, tugging at one of his wrists, urging him to stop it. His hands left his eyes, but instead lifted to tug at his hair, and Shota sighed heavily. "I grabbed Stain. I put him in my mindscape," Midoriya went on, almost breathlessly. "And then the Nomu grabbed me." Midoriya trailed off, one of his hands touching his side. "I grabbed it with my right hand and put it in my mindscape, which shouldn't have worked, but it did." Shota raised a brow at that. That was new information. Did it mean Midoriya's quirk did not require 5 points of contact to activate, or had it just adapted to his right hand? Shota had heard of quirks adapting to physical limitations of the user, so it wasn't entirely impossible that... "It died, Sensei." Shota started, his hands jerking on the steering wheel. Midoriya didn't seem to notice the abrupt movement of the vehicle. "I put the Nomu in my head with Stain, and then Stain killed it while they were both in there. I took them both out, but it's like I can still feel the blood in my mindscape, staining my mind. And I can still feel death, Sensei. I felt that Nomu end completely, and I just can't." Midoriya dissolved into shakes, and Shota stared out the dash, eyes wide. Fuck, he needed a drink. Mike had finished his patrol by the time they got back, and was asleep on the couch, still in his hero costume, arm pressed over his eyes, and tall hair smashed against the arm. Shota looked at him worriedly, before turning to make sure Midoriya got up the steps safely with his injuries. Midoriya walked in and looked longingly at the couch. "You know, that bed is still open for you," Shota told the kid, shutting the door behind them. Midoriya shook his head rapidly, a strange look passing across his face before disappearing just as quickly as it had arrived. He walked over to the coffee table in front of the couch, setting his bag down next to it. Shota then watched as the boy crawled under it, his small body fitting easily. Wink appeared out of the woodwork and joined him. Shota shook his head with a sigh and then moved over to crouch in front of the couch by his husband's head. He usually didn't keep his uniform on after a patrol, preferring to let his hair down. "Zashi," Shota whispered, rubbing his thumb across the voice hero's cheekbone. "Mm-hmm," Izashi murmured, pulling his arm away from his eyes and looking sideways at Shota without moving his head. "Get the kid." "Yeah, I got him." Shota glanced back at Midoriya, who was curled up as tightly as possible beneath the coffee table, Wink purring away on his side. Izashi followed his line of sight and frowned. "He okay?" His voice was becoming more clear as he woke up. "He'll be fine," Shota reassured him. "What about you? Something happened." Izashi sighed, and his arm went back over his eyes again. Shota's frown deepened, and he scooted up onto the couch to sit next to his husband, laying a hand on his forehead. "There was a jumper at the spot," Izashi explained, his voice thick. Shota stilled, jaw tightening. Izashi was referring to the suicide spot that he tended to check during almost every patrol after he had found someone there many years ago. It wasn't terribly often that he found someone, but when he did, well, it certainly wasn't a good time. Shota didn't say anything, though, not wanting to push his husband. If Izashi wanted to talk, he would. And he did. "I was able to keep him conversing until emergency services got there," Izashi said, his voice a whisper. "But the things he said, they were just... he was only 16. Izashi suddenly moved his hand, looking at Shota with watery, chartreuse eyes, and Shota's gut churned. He suddenly remembered Midoriya's words in the car. "I can still feel death, Sensei." Shota glanced back at the kid. His green eyes were open now, and they were watching the both of them. There was something in those eyes that Shota really didn't like. He turned back to Izashi, though, one problem at a time. "Let's get you out of that uniform," Shota said, pulling his husband up. "You just want to undress me," Izashi mumbled, resorting to jokes as a coping mechanism, as he always did. Behind him, Midoriya made a choked noise, and Shota ignored it, shaking his head. Izashi complained as Shota tried to pull him up, but he eventually capitulated, allowing Shota to get him up and take him to the bathroom so that they could wash the obscene levels of hair products out of his hair. Even with the couch vacated, Izuku stayed beneath the coffee table with Wink. He felt surprisingly safe where he was and wasn't keen to leave that feeling. He uncurled a little bit so that he could hug Wink to his chest. She allowed him to maneuver her back against him, and then she shoved her head back to rest beneath his chin, her ears laying softly against his neck. Izuku hugged her almost as tightly as he could without hurting her, his breath hitching. Wink helped so much. She was the biggest reason he still stayed with the two pro heroes. The thought of being without her was physically painful to Izuku at this point. Aizawa came back sometime later and knelt to peer beneath the coffee table at Izuku. His teacher sighed, allowing himself to roll back into a sitting position. Aizawa was no longer wearing his capture weapon, and his hair was up in a bun, the ends of his hair damp from helping Mike clean his own hair. "Kid, I have to ask." Aizawa met his eyes. "Are you planning on doing anything to hurt yourself?" Izuku's brow furrowed. "No, why would I?" Izuku trailed off, remembering the conversation Aizawa and Mike had been having. Izuku looked away, burying his face in Wink's fur. "I've thought about it," he admitted stiffly. He'd more than thought about it once, a long time ago, but that wasn't going to happen again, even if it was on his mind a lot. Aizawa made a noise of apprehension. "How often do you think about it?" His voice was gentler than Izuku thinks he had ever heard it before, and it embarrassed him. He had never talked about this kind of stuff with anyone but his therapist. "Relatively often? I don't know." Izuku shrugged, not looking up. Izuku's eyes closed. "I used to be bullied a lot. People Kachan, told me to kill myself a lot. My dad told me that he wished I wasn't alive, and my mom just... Aizawa's arm snaked beneath the coffee table and pulled Izuku out from under it and against his teacher's chest. Izuku hadn't even realized that he'd begun to hyperventilate. Gods, he was so messed up. Izuku hadn't cried. He felt too numb for that, so it didn't take long for him to focus on his teacher's breathing and settle his own. "When is your next therapist appointment, problem child?" Aizawa asked once Izuku was back to normal. He sounded exhausted. Izuku rubbed his chest, leaning away. "I haven't made an appointment yet. My schedule has been unclear." Aizawa nodded. "It might be a good idea to make an appointment. You have a couple of days clear since your internship ended early." Aizawa met his eyes as if a thought had suddenly occurred to him. "Have you taken your medicine today?" Izuku suddenly looked up. "Oh, no, I forgot since I've been in the hospital." "Mm-hmm," Aizawa said, standing up. He grabbed Izuku's yellow backpack and slid it over to him. He knew the kid's medicine was in there because he had made sure of it before Midoriya had left for Gran Torino's. Aizawa then went over to the kitchen to get a cup of water and bring it back to Izuku, who had all of his medicine curled in his gloved hand. Shota handed the boy the cup of water, and he quickly swallowed the entire handful of pills. "Okay," Shota said, watching Midoriya carefully. "I'm going to take a nap before my patrol tonight. Are you safe?" There was a slight downturn of his lips, almost as if irritated, and the kid pulled Wink toward him. "I'm safe," he said. Shota nodded. "Good. Wake me if you need anything." He then grabbed a sleeping bag from the back of the couch and headed toward his and Zashi's room. Taking care of two sad people really took it out of a person. All right, listeners, this concludes the first half to Chapter 13 of State of Mind. The second half to this chapter will be up next. I really like this fic a lot. I really like the mental health themes that come into play for this one. The fact that Izuku's quirk is a mental quirk, and the fact that his mental state is a big factor in how his quirk actually manifests. I think that's a really cool component here because you get the opportunity to really tie in how depression has an impact on him, past trauma, things like that. So it's really interesting to see what the author does here as far as really diving into some of the trauma, the depression that Izuku's experiencing. So I'm curious to hear what you all thought as well. Drop those comments below. And as always, thank you all so much for listening.